All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Popiwa, and I am the chair of the Sustainable Economy Advisory Council. Thank you all for joining, and I will call this meeting to order, the September 2022 meeting of our council. I'm now going to call the roll for our committee. So Daisy Maldonado.
Here.
Thank you. Patricia Knighton. I see you on, so I'm going to mark you as here. Glenn Schiffbauer.
Here.
Thank you. Rob Black. Do not see you present. Absent. Casi Arias. Jonathan Perry.
Here.
Thank you. Mayani Bruden.
Here.
Welcome. Axa Chavez.
Here, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. JT Willie.
Present.
Thank you. Wendy Adsity. Janine Yazzie is absent. Joe Little. And Marissa Naranjo. Okay. You all will have received the agenda prior to this meeting. It's also been posted as public notice last week on NMEDD website. And so I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda for our meeting today. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion to approve.
Thank you, Glenn. Do I have a second?
Jonathan Perry, second.
Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
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 Thank you. Motion carries. And so I'm very excited to have two different presenters today. Ricky Seguin will be presenting first, and then Sammy Cow from CVNM. Ricky, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and also present, just give an overview of what you're going to be presenting today? And then please proceed into your presentation.
Sure. Okay. Well, hi, everybody. Good to see names that I know and names that I don't know. I am wondering, James, if it's possible for me to share my screen.
Yes, let me figure out how to give you that permission.
Okay, thank you. I'm Ricky Seguin. I work as the executive director of an organization called Interwest Energy Alliance, and I have some slides. I'll do a little brief explanation of who we are. The point of my presentation today is to really walk through the drivers for renewable energy development in New Mexico, and then talk about how this additional renewable development fits in with the overall important and complicated question of how to diversify the budget. I also have on the line Angela Patali, who is on contract with Interwest as our tax expert. And so should there be questions about how we're taxed or really anything having to do with tax and renewables, Angela is the right person. So she's on here in case we have any questions today. And James, I think on my Zoom, when I next to share screen as the host on the bottom of the thing, there should be like a little button that you can press where you can open it up to say, allow all participants to share or something.
Let me take a look.
Okay, thank you. And I think for some people on here, you've probably heard me give a version of this presentation to legislative committees. And depending on how you all usually structure these, I'm happy to have questions along the way. All in, the presentation is probably it takes about 17 minutes. So you can interrupt me or we can take questions at the end. I see it now. Thank you, James. let's see, can you see this in slideshow version, or does it show the various, like, next slide thing?
I'm seeing various next slides, so I think we're seeing your entire screen, or there we go. That's in slideshow version.
Okay, super. So I'll just go ahead and jump in. Interwest is the regional trade association for utility scale renewable energy developers and manufacturers. We're a nonprofit, 501c6 nonprofit, headquartered here in New Mexico, which is where I live, but we also do work around the region in 5 other states. The members of Interwest are all available on our website, but it's many of the companies that you're likely familiar with just from watching more renewable development in the state, as well as a number of environmental NGOs that also sit within our membership. So where I like to start in having a conversation about renewables in New Mexico, utility scale renewables in New Mexico, is where I think many of us start, which is the Energy Transition Act. And I want to say those words because once I say them, I'm not really going to say them at all again for the rest of this presentation. And the reason for that is that while the ETA really was landmark and has transitioned our state onto a course of rapid decarbonization and more renewables on the system, because the load, the electric load in New Mexico is so small compared to the rest of the West, the ETA itself is really not what's driving most of the additional renewable energy development we see in our state, nor will it be the reason why the influx of projects will come. Absolutely, there will be more renewable projects built to serve the needs of PNM, El Paso Electric, SPS, as well as our rural co-ops. But because the load here is small and the opportunity to build renewables is big, and because there are customers all around the West who need renewables, most of the projects that will be built in our state will be built to serve customers outside of New Mexico. And I'll explain how that is and why that is. But it's just a really important foundational starting point for a conversation around renewable energy in New Mexico. Most of the projects being built will be built to serve customers elsewhere. And that's because the load here is so small. Today, we have about 5 gigawatts of renewable energy projects online in the state. If there is one takeaway from my presentation, I hope that you would have, it is this map, which is very nerdy, but in my life, very cool. This shows the various interconnections of the transmission grid in our country. When we started building transmission lines in the US, we started at the coasts and we built inward. When we got to the Rocky Mountains, we basically stopped. So there are very few, actually only 7 points where the Western electric grid physically touches the Eastern electric grid. That means that electrons don't move from the east to the west. We can talk about how small these interconnection points are, but again, there's only 7 of them and they are tiny. So when we're talking about moving electricity to customers all around the region, buying and selling renewable energy, we're really only talking about the West because our electric grid just doesn't really touch anything to the east, nor does it really touch anything in Texas. I want to note that there's a small portion of southeastern New Mexico that is part of the eastern grid, but the bulk of the population in New Mexico and certainly the bulk of the land mass is in the western interconnection. And the total electric demand in New Mexico makes up under 4% of all of the electric demand in the western interconnection. Again, very small compared to overall electric demand in the Western United States. So take a mental snapshot of WEC here, the Western Interconnection. This is the region we're going to be talking about this whole presentation about buying and selling renewable energy and how New Mexico can benefit from projects being built here to serve customers around the West. In the West, we're pretty darn aligned on decarbonization at this point. This red oval is meant to show you about where that line is for the Eastern and Western electric grid. And you can see that most of the states in the Western Interconnection have some sort of clean energy requirement, which means that by law, the electric utilities in these states will have to buy a ton of renewable energy. If they don't, they will be violating the law. So there is a customer, the utilities, and there is a thing they have to buy, renewable energy, and they can buy it from anywhere in the West. And what I'm pitching to you is that we want those projects to be in New Mexico. Just how much renewable energy is going to be bought and sold in the West is unlike anything we've ever seen before. In order to meet the laws on the books today, no other law changes, the West will need an additional 9 gigawatts of new renewable energy projects built every single year for multiple decades. Again, as context, all of the renewable energy projects we have in New Mexico right now add up to about 5 gigawatts. So we're talking West-wide needing to build a new 9 gigawatts every single year. The demand for renewables is greater than 150 gigawatts of new projects. It's going to be a lot of building. So why would a utility in the West choose to buy renewable energy from New Mexico? On the map here, you can see the Western United States and the net import versus export of electricity. This map is a few years old, but you can see that states like California and Nevada are importers of electricity. States like New Mexico, Colorado are net exporters of electricity. I expect if I were able to get my hands on a more updated version of this, New Mexico would be even more red, and places like California and Nevada would be even more blue. I also expect the Northwest to be a little bit bluer than it is right now in terms of import. But what this means is that there is a constant flow of transactions for electricity all around the West. It's very different from something like an oil and gas marketplace, where with oil and gas, a product is being removed from the ground and shipped into a global commodity marketplace. With electrons, we're only competing with the rest of our region because that's the only place where we're connected with those wires. And by and large, we are an export state for electricity. Again, demand here is very small versus demand in the West being very big. And this is a lot of words, but what I want to explain is the process by which a utility buys electricity. The standard steps for this is that a utility, let's use Nevada Energy, NV Energy as an example. A utility would identify a need, that they need more electricity. Maybe they have a coal plant going offline, they have a new data center coming in, more electric vehicle charging, you name it, but they say we need more electricity. And they issue an RFP, a request for proposal, for more electricity. What happens next is that companies will bid in proposed projects from all around the region. The utility will look at those bids, they'll pick their favorite, and the projects that win will get built. The projects that lose do not get built. If you can't win, you don't have any guarantee that you're going to get paid. And so you're not going to spend the upwards of $10 million to build a thing. So you have to win an RFP in order to have a project built. New Mexico projects have to win RFPs if we want to build stuff here. These are super competitive. They're so competitive. This is an example of a Public Service Company of Colorado RFP from 2018, where they were looking for 454 megawatts. That was all they were looking for in an RFP, just under 500 megawatts of power. What they got was 430 bids for 112,000 megawatts of electricity. It is so competitive. And you can see it's not just wind versus wind or wind versus solar. It's an all source RFP. So come one, come all. If you got a project idea, bid it in and we'll see who wins it. The utility is ultimately going to select. All the projects that lose are not getting built. So it is a cutthroat world out there for electricity generation right now. You have to win bids in order to be built. So why would we win in New Mexico? Why are we winning right now? The first thing is resource. A utility would want to buy a certain type of resource. They want to buy renewables because they're required by law to buy renewables. Also, they may want to decarbonize, their customers may want it. but they also have to do it by law. On the solar side, you can see in our region, while New Mexico is extremely sunny, so is Arizona, California, Nevada. And just like shipping goods down a highway, the further you move those goods down a highway, typically the more expensive they get because you're paying for gas, you're paying for labor. It's similar with renewable energy or any electricity. The further the electrons have to move down the wire to get to the customer, the more expensive it gets. So while it's true that New Mexico solar projects can win selling to Nevada or Oregon or California, it's kind of hard because we're competing against states that are closer to those customers. So their projects are often cheaper. In the case of wind, it's a very different story. And this is why you're seeing so much wind development in eastern New Mexico. We have this pocket of really windy purple land. All of the windiest parts of the country happen to be to the east of us. They are on the east side of that line that electrons don't cross, meaning we're not competing with Iowa or Texas. We're really only competing with Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. And in that analogy of moving goods down a highway, we're all equally far from those customers. So this is where New Mexico renewable energy really has an opportunity, is for selling wind into the broader marketplace.
Ricky, really quickly, I know
Sure.
that Patricia has her hand up, but
Oh, great.
Patricia, we could hold until the end of Ricky's,
Happy to, yes.
if that's okay, unless it's something pertinent.
Yeah. Go
okay.
ahead, please go ahead.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And thank you, James. I didn't see that. So in addition to the right resources being in New Mexico, wind, sun, the other thing is that the resources we're selling pair really well with the other resources a utility may already have. So in the case of California, who's buying a ton of renewable energy right now, they have a lot of solar on their grid. We've all read the stories. But what happens when the sun goes down? It happens to be the time of day that New Mexico wind is doing its best. New Mexico's wind profile is best at night. So New Mexico wind pairs really well with California sun. So that is another check in the box of New Mexico renewables that make our products desirable to the broader Western marketplace. Really though, all things being equal, a utility is going to pick the project that is the lowest cost for their customers. And in the case of New Mexico wind, it is the lowest cost wind that you can buy in the West right now. Remember, I noted we're really only competing with Montana, Colorado, and Wyoming because they're the only other states in the Western grid that have any of that really good purple wind. We are cheaper than all of those states. If you had a wind project in New Mexico that didn't use an industrial revenue bond, however, suddenly we are the most expensive of those four. So this difference in price is very delicate, and more often than not, this is what's deciding if a project will win an RFP and ultimately get built. I have two examples here of, again, just how close this is. These are two different RFPs from the last one I showed, one in Nevada and one Black Hills. I think this is Black Hills, Colorado. And once a utility gets all those bids to the RFP, they shorten it down to their final shortlist, couple of projects that they select from. The difference in cost from the highest and lowest bid in this shortlist for NV Energy was 50 cents per megawatt hour. In the case of Black Hills, it was 87 cents per megawatt hour. So a minor difference in price, something like $1 per megawatt hour, suddenly pushes a New Mexico project out of the money. And that project will instead be built in another state like Colorado where it can win. So this financial advantage or economic advantage that we have right now is an important thing to keep in mind. So that's my context for why renewables are why utilities want to buy them from New Mexico. Now it is, why on earth would we want them here? Why would we want to be a state that is building stuff just for export? And I know that question gets asked a lot. We want it for economic diversification. Renewable energy projects pay taxes. We are paying taxes now. We've been paying taxes, and we're going to continue to pay taxes. We pay gross receipts taxes, corporate income tax, personal income tax, and we pay property taxes. If we are doing an IRB, an industrial revenue bond, we pay direct payments to the county and school district instead of property taxes. But there is money going into the state coffers and to local budgets because of the renewable energy development we have today. While we're talking about taxes, I want to address something head on, which is, would we be better served by having a new tax just on renewables? Would that allow us to diversify our budget even more? I'm going to say, unless that's done very carefully so that it doesn't compromise the competitive advantage that New Mexico projects currently have, the answer is no. We only bring in more money from taxes if we keep building the things that those taxes are paid on. So there is a ton here, nobody panic. I'm not even going to go through all of it, but I am going to point out a few things. Moss Adams did a study a few years ago where they looked at the impacts of a Wyoming-style wind generation tax on New Mexico. That's up here in the top right. In 2010, the state of Wyoming passed a bill that enacted a $1 per megawatt hour tax on all wind generation in the state. And you can see that while wind was on the rise in Wyoming, as soon as that wind tax went into effect, it plateaued. The reason for that was not because developers don't want to build in Wyoming. You better believe they want to access that good wind in Wyoming. It's that they can't win bids anymore. They cannot win in RFPs because it's too expensive. New Mexico, on the other hand, has been a steady growth of renewable energy coming into the state. So what Moss Adams did is they had a base case scenario for renewable development in New Mexico based on compliance with the ETA versus a growth case where they say, here's the pipeline for renewable energy projects as it stands right now. All in with a new $1 per megawatt hour tax in New Mexico, their estimate is that the state would lose $6.7 billion in tax revenue and other local economic benefits over the next 10 years. So this is to illustrate that it is very important to think about tax changes carefully, which I know this group knows, but to illustrate the point that a new tax doesn't necessarily mean more revenue. It only means more revenue if those projects can continue to be built. And in the case of renewables, they can only continue to be built if they can continue to win against Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. I am almost done. I'm sure there'll be questions there. I'll note a few other revenue streams for New Mexicans from renewable energy development. Already the industry has invested $9 billion into New Mexico. I think a really important story to tell is about these direct landowner payments, where annually rural New Mexicans are receiving about $32 million from renewable energy leases, which these people are paying taxes on. We're also employing just under 4,000 New Mexicans. And as the pipeline for new projects continues to grow, we also expect the workforce number to increase. We also see a huge commitment from the state land office in bringing renewable energy projects to state trust lands. You can see, I think there's a lot on this slide, but what I would say is where we are right now is this, what I'm circling, the active leases for wind and solar versus the applications that the state land office has for more wind and solar leases. We really expect this to continue, and I know the state land office is adding additional staff to help them process this demand. So moving forward, big takeaway, no surprise from me, if we want more money from renewables, which I think we all do, we need to just build more projects. That is the best way to bring in more revenue from renewable energy. We have to remain competitive if we want to win bids. That's the only thing. We're selling to customers across the region because that's where the customers are. And finally, a thing I did not even talk about, but is a really important piece of this puzzle. In order to move this renewable energy around the West, we're going to need more transmission lines. Not only do we need to build more lines, we also need to better manage our existing lines. So both transmission expansion and grid modernization through things like a regional transmission organization are going to be critical to decarbonizing the West, bringing more revenue to our state, and putting more New Mexicans to work. So that's where I'll end. And I am happy, as always, to take lots of questions here and then also offline if people have more questions than we have time for. Thanks.
Thank you, Ricky. Super appreciate your presentation. And Patricia, you were first in the queue for a question.
Thanks. Hey, thank you for that really great presentation, Ricky. My question, you probably answered it, but it was back on your bid slide. I think that might have been slide 8 or something. Oh, this one's
Yeah,
good.
okay.
12. Is it all just purely a cost bid? Are these results only cost? Is the evaluation simply cost?
Great question. Thank you for that. No, the utility with their RFP, it will differ RFP by RFP and utility by utility, but they have a variety of scoring metrics that they'll give different weight to. So price will certainly come into it. Sometimes things like location will come into play as a scoring metric. So for example, the utility may want the project to be located in a school district where a coal plant is closing. So there are lots of factors that get built into a scoring matrix that the utility considers.
Gotcha. Okay, I got the feeling it was only cost, but it's much broader than that. So that's great. And when you say that the real value to us is to build more projects, is that the generator's decision or action, or how does that happen? I know I just don't know much about this, so I appreciate your help.
The generator's decision in terms of building more, I want to make sure I'm answering your question properly.
Yeah. So when you said we just need to, we're making money, we need to build more, and is that who builds those? Who are we talking about taking that action? Great
question. Typically, it's independent power producers. Independent companies who are doing it, and they are the ones that are bidding into these RFPs around the West. So in order to build more, I would say it's not for lack of trying from companies in New Mexico that there aren't more already. It's that there need to be more RFPs and they need to win those. Sometimes the utility will build its own projects. I'll note that but in the case of New Mexico, again, because the load is so small, there's less, PNM developed projects on the horizon than there are IPPs building projects to serve all those other utilities in the West.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the questions.
Rob, you have your hand up.
Thank you, James. And Ricky, or the group, sorry I was a little late. I was coming over from the EDD conference at the hotel. Ricky, did you talk at all about why New Mexico's energy is so much cheaper or more competitive in the context of, did you talk at all about the capacity factor issues that we have going on here in New Mexico?
I didn't explicitly. I had a slide on that I removed. Thank you for the question, Rob. No, but I'll say this at a high level for folks, the capacity factor is basically what your output is for your project. You might have a 10 megawatt solar facility, but that solar facility is not producing that much power at all times because the sun goes down and clouds are real and there's snow, etc. The panels get old, all sorts of things. So the capacity factor is its average output of electricity. Our capacity factor for both solar and wind is very good in New Mexico. For solar, it's good because we don't have the weather impacts that some of the competing states have. It's just sunny a lot of the time. But also solar does better at high elevation. So that's a plus for example, New Mexico solar over Arizona solar. In the case of wind, we have very high capacity factors in eastern New Mexico. That's really a symptom of this purple average wind speed side here. And as technologies get better, so do the capacity factors. So that is a great point to bring up, Rob, is that we have high capacity factors in New Mexico, meaning our projects are producing more electrons at a higher percentage than maybe they would in other states.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to thank you for that. That you actually explained it a heck of a lot better than I did.
Well, I would hope so, Rob. We have different jobs, so.
Yeah, well, fair enough. But I think the thing that's really important on that is California's wind capacity factor is about 25%. We're about 48%. So it's part of where you start to get a much better economics in New Mexico than other states. But that's again a reason where we should really leverage that competitive advantage that nature gave us as we think about, where we can build out this sector. So I think it's an important thing to remind folks. But the other kind of nature of that, right, is 20, on an average in California, wind's only providing the full power 25% of the time. And so you do have to really look at diversification, whether it's, again, with solar, storage, battery, all these other pieces as we think about integrating into a really healthy, resilient grid. But obviously, wind is such a key piece for us in New Mexico. So I wanted to highlight that natural competitive that nature's given us with the. As a kid from Eastern New Mexico, I had to live with that wind growing up. At least we can get something out of it.
Right.
Rob, thanks for raising that. I want to say, my answer was, sort of in how it works, and our capacity factor is good. You make such a good point on the cost piece. The cost advantage that we have is not just based on our tax structure. It's that if you build a wind farm in California for 100 widgets, make up a unit, you get 25% output. Versus if you build a wind farm for 100 widgets in New Mexico, you get 40+ of percentage of output. So you get more bang for your buck, I guess is the easier way to say it. So yeah, I really appreciate you raising that. Thank you.
Thank you. And, I just want to thank you. I see you, Mayani. I'm so glad that you are raising your hand. Do you have a question?
Just really quickly, I hope it's a quick question, is can you share a little bit about the status of transitioning to an RTO in the West, and particularly for New Mexico, where we're at?
Absolutely. There are a few topics that make me more excited and other people less excited to hear about, Mayani. So you've hit on my pet project. Yes. So this very last bullet point I have here, I say a regional transmission organization can help us achieve our goals. And without going too into depth, the bulk of the country, the electric grids, the utilities are organized into things called RTOs, regional transmission organizations. California has one, New England, the Midwest, and it's a central operator who helps manage the grid more efficiently, helps decide where transmission goes based on need, who pays for it, et cetera, based on formulas. We don't have that in the West. It's a shocking absence in the Western part of this country. And so there are quite a few conversations ongoing about building a new RTO or expanding on an RTO like the one in California or the one to the east of us, Southwest Power Pool. And several states, Colorado and Nevada, have passed laws in recent years that require their utilities to join an RTO by 2030. So what we know is that big utilities in the West are thinking and or required to join an RTO in the next decade. And that's putting a ton of pressure on utilities like ours in New Mexico to get serious about an RTO. So we think that's a huge opportunity. It is a huge boon for decarbonization, for saving ratepayers money, for getting more projects built in the places we need them. Where we are right now is that California's RTO called CAISO and the one to the east of us, SPP, are building out service offerings to our region, and our utilities in the West are joining them in different ways. There are several public utility commissions in the West that have dockets open investigating the benefits of RTOs. I'm giving a broad answer, which is to say, I think it boils down to there are a lot of conversations happening. There's definitely an RTO coming to the West in the next 10 years. What it looks like, I think it still remains to be seen, but it's a super hot topic right now. And New Mexico needs to be at the table in making sure that it works for us.
Thanks, Ricky. So I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions before we move on to our next presenter. And I'm happy to open up this segment to also any non-council members who joined, if you have any questions for Ricky. Patricia, you're off mute. I'm not sure if that means you have an additional question.
Actually, no.
Okay. Well, I have one final question, Ricky. I mean, are there additional barriers that you see for New Mexico to become, a major exporter leading in the West on renewables?
It's a great question, James. What we don't need is more incentives. I will say that pretty clearly. Like we're winning. We're doing great. I do fear that the conflict over siting and land use is going to boil over. And so I think being really strategic about how we're talking about renewable energy development and land use is going to be important. There's certainly legislation on the horizon that worries us. But overall, I hate to say everything's great because everything's not perfect, but we need certainty. Business likes certainty in order to invest money. And so having to fend off rumors of new taxes and things like that year after year decrease certainty. The change in the Public Regulation Commission, obviously that big transition makes it hard for certainty. So as a new commission gets in place and gets comfortable, I think that will help investors feel more comfortable. We need to create a business environment that makes companies feel safe investing their money here. That would be the broad story I would tell about what we need to do.
Thanks, Ricky. Tom?
Yeah, thanks, James, for the opportunity to take you. Hello, Vicky.
Hi,
Wonderful
Tom. Good to see
presentation.
you.
Your energy is awesome. Yeah, I'll take advantage of your offer. Ricky, is there any work done or being done forecasting the jobs and income and revenue from the kind of build out that you might envision or that your organization would want to see? I've just seen so many exchanges in watching interim committees this interim where supporters of oil and gas and comparing oil and gas to renewables say, you build a project, there are a few jobs, and then when it's operating, there are no jobs. And yet I hear you and developers and others, that the build out could last decades, and there could be construction year after year after year after year. Is that being quantified? Is that being brought to the legislature's attention and to this group's attention?
Thanks, Tom. I would say not as much as it should. I think that the state having a plan would really help in providing that roadmap and that certainty. I'll use an example. We get asked a lot, well, how do we bring manufacturing to New Mexico? Could we bring a wind turbine blade manufacturing facility here? Unless they're sure that there's going to be people buying wind turbine blades in New Mexico to the tune of 10 gigawatts, they can't build here. So we need a pipeline. We need to show what our plan is in order to court folks to come. That also is true for job training. If it's stop and start in the marketplace, it is hard to sustain a workforce that can go to work every day doing this type of work. I would say this slide, which I know is crazy, with how much is on there, shows that growth path for building new renewables and what the economic impacts of that are. We might want to do that on the workforce side too. But I think that sometimes we do ourselves a disservice. Renewable energy development will not equal oil and gas 1-to-1 on jobs. We require fewer workers. It is a fact. The most money comes in the construction phase, and the most jobs are present in the construction phase. And then these projects are pretty plug and play afterward. I sometimes feel like we pigeonhole ourselves into pretending we can save everything. These are not 1-to-1 with oil and gas. So we need to figure out what are the other parts of this industry, this workforce that we can train in our state. It's not just construction work, which is important. It's not just blade maintenance. It's legal support. It is technical support. It's engineering. There are so many parts of the workforce supply chain that we should be tapping into for renewable energy in our state. We don't have a plan for it. We haven't quantified it, and we can do a better job, and I think we should.
Thanks, Ricky. Super appreciate it. And I couldn't say it better. We really do need to have a broad definition and approach to what does, imagining a regenerative economy for the state. And so, what are the many different opportunities for renewable jobs that are connected to all of these pieces of economic development. Thank you so much for presenting. Please send me your slide presentation, and I will also share with the committee. Most of the folks know you, but I will share your contact information with the entire committee, and would love to have you back sometime soon. We appreciate you as a strong partner.
Thank you very much, James. Thanks everybody for the time. Happy to talk more offline. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Ricky. Hey, James, if I could, just before we jump to the next one, I think there's one other piece, kind of ripping off of what Tom said around economic development and kind of the impacts of all the sectors that this economic strategy pulls out. The renewable and green energy has two key ways of thinking about economic development. One is the direct jobs that we're talking about right now. The other is the ability to recruit and retain other industries in green manufacturing, server farms, et cetera, where those companies have really strong ESG goals, and we can provide that renewable energy. We become much more competitive for recruiting those ancillary industries. So I think, but I don't think we have a good way of measuring that metric and quantifying that value to our economy. And I would love for, whether it's this group or figuring out how do we say, by being able to provide 100% renewable energy, reliable renewable energy to Facebook or whoever, that creates this economic competitive advantage for us for another sectors. But I think that's another story we need to be able to tell as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. And there you and I may have alignment. I really appreciate you elevating that. And, considering that we're a volunteer committee, I know that this is within your wheelhouse and that of other people as well. If there's a matrix that you feel like you could present to the committee to review, that's something that I think would be great added value. So thank you for raising that. So I want to introduce our next presenters. So very happy to have Sammy Cow from Conservation Voters New Mexico. Sammy is a climate and energy advocate for CVNM, and she is going to be presenting today on opportunities in the upcoming legislature. Very happy to have you here today. I'll turn it over to you, Sammy. And if I can allow you to share your screen, please let me know.
Yes, please. I would like the screen sharing option, please.
Believe you should have access now. Let me know if there's any trouble. Great, I can see your screen.
Awesome. I will go into, if I can, slideshow mode.
Perfect, I think we're there.
Cool. Well, that's a very tough act to follow, Ricky, but I hope I can channel that energy and level of expertise. Hi, council members. My name is Sammy. I am the climate energy advocate with Conservation Voters New Mexico, like James said. And today I am representing the broader environmental and climate coalition today as we continue this conversation around developing the climate bill for 2023. I have several colleagues today on the call in the audience as well as on the council itself. So I really appreciate everyone's presence and support as we continue on this conversation. And I want to thank the council for allowing me the time to share these ideas with you. And as these ideas transform into actual bill language, our hope is that the Sustainable Economy Advisory Council, as well as the Sustainable Economy Task Force, which I will later refer to as SET Force, and other community-based coalitions such as Power for New Mexico can provide some guidance on how we can make New Mexico's transition away from oil and gas as just and equitable as possible. And I'll go on to the next slide. A quick lay of the land so that you all have some background on how we got these ideas for the climate bill and how they all came together. As most of you will know, this is the third time that comprehensive climate legislation will be introduced in the session. We had HB 9 in 2021 and HB 6 in 2022. HB 6 in this last session, as most of us know, had to share the stage with HB 4, the Hydrogen Hub Act, which a lot of the time consumed most of the air out of the room anytime climate was a part of the conversation. But despite that, we still passed House Bill 37, which was the Community Energy Efficiency Block Grant, We passed that in 2022, and it's currently awaiting the rulemaking process with MNERD. Community solar is now in the hands of the Public Regulation Commission, and we also had our methane rules at the Oil Conservation Division and the Environmental Improvement Board go into effect earlier this year. We also passed Advanced Clean Car Initiatives, Advanced Clean Car 1 initiatives earlier this year. And importantly, we passed Senate Bill 112, which was the Sustainable Economy Task Force back in 2021. And as the climate bill comes together, the knowledge, expertise, and leadership from those on set force will be critical, especially in developing the equity components of the climate bill. So with all that said, what is going to be different in 2023 as compared to previous years? We had the governor's executive order from 2019, where she acknowledged the harmful impacts of climate change to our most vulnerable communities. And she has made recent public comments reinforcing the need for additional climate action. And in order to address some of the struggles that we had with hydrogen in the last session, the environmental community has made it a very strong point to leave hydrogen out of any kind of conversation around the climate bill. And finally, we have had a significant head start compared to last year. This whole summer, we have been in the trenches of developing ideas for this bill, whereas last year we were not really able to get a full start on it until October. So with all that said, let's jump into the actual proposed sections for the bill. This first section lays out the emissions targets for 2030 and 2050, and these numbers are not unsimilar to what we saw in HB 6 of 2022. For the 2030 target, we're looking at a 50% reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions compared to 2005 levels, and this goal is only to be achieved with direct emissions reductions. Initial analysis show that this goal is incredibly ambitious, but still also very achievable. In fact, earlier this year, we had the technical advisory group of the Climate Change Task Force, also known as the TAG process. And that included some of the members here on this council, and they identified a list of policies. And if these policies are to be fully and properly implemented, we can get New Mexico very close to our 2030 goal. And for our 2050 goal, we are looking for emission levels to be reduced by 90% of gross emissions compared to 2005 levels. And that is with the remaining 10% being more flexible, and that these reductions can be reached using emissions offsets. And I can elaborate more on that if there are questions that come up. For the second section, it will lay out who has authority to do what, and this will be a pretty significant change from what we saw in HB 6. For this bill, we are proposing a broad authority grant to all state agencies, departments, commissions, councils, et cetera, to implement rules, pass resolutions, and so on and so forth that are deemed necessary to meet our 2030 and 2050 goals. There have been some concerns around this idea, and some of them, and I'll discuss a little bit of them. One of them is the issue of there might be too many cooks in the kitchen. Basically, if every agency has power, then who really actually has power? So the Climate Coalition does agree that there needs to be some kind of gatekeeping process, particularly with MNERD or NMED, and making sure that they serve a little bit of a leadership or gatekeeping role as the other agencies make their rulemakings. There have also been folks who have expressed concern with a lack of checks and balances with a broad authority grant. Let's say some years from now, we have some secretaries heading our agencies who might want to reverse some very climate-friendly rules or implement rules that might adversely affect climate. To prevent that, it's important to note this clause. If I can get my mouse, this clause right here. Pertaining to climate change mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and making sure that stays in the bill. And this very much just limits agencies to rulemaking that can only support our climate goals. So that's one issue that we have a fairly solid solution for, but I think it'll be really important to stay alert on potential problems with checks and balances. And we may want to discuss and develop some ideas for guardrails and how the legislature can play a more significant role, and et cetera. There's also going to be a subsection for tribal consultation, and the language that is included on the slide was pulled from HB6. And we have an expert on tribal consultation sitting on this very council, and her leadership on this has been and will continue to be critical. This third section on energy transition is where we're really looking for the leadership and guidance of this council and set force, as well as the community-based coalitions such as Power for Mexico. And in the audience, I believe I have Michael Leon Guerrero, who is leading Power for Mexico, and he's with CCP. And I look forward to any input he might have later on. We've had meetings with Power for Mexico members, and there have been some ideas that we've hatched, but there's still work to be done in terms of ironing out some of those details. First, we need to protect those who work in the extractive industry and provide support for those communities as we transition away from oil and gas. And this support should come in the form of guaranteed basic income or increased retirement benefits and unemployment insurance. An idea that Power for Mexico has already come together and agreed on is the creation of a Just Transition Office, who will be in charge of directing funds and resources during all phases of transition to vulnerable communities. There's also broad support for the creation of a dedicated trust fund to support economic development and workforce transition. And finally, there is, and I want to put an emphasis that there is a lot of support for renewable energy in this energy transition when we've seen, and that is because we've seen, folks from oil and gas try and finagle the definition of energy transition to kind of include work that they also do. Another important section that we very much need this council's guidance on is to address is for climate adaptation and resiliency to impacts of climate change. Even as we work towards a renewable, clean energy future, our most vulnerable communities will still face consequences of long-term climate inaction in the upcoming years. So we must protect these communities by addressing areas of the highest concern, and that would include things like reliable water resources, wildfire and emergency response, land management, drought, displacement of families, energy burdens, improving infrastructure and affordable housing. And creating a climate resiliency office to lead on these efforts will help New Mexicans adapt to changing weather conditions, and creating the infrastructure fund to invest in these efforts can help with our overburdened communities to survive and thrive as we are making our way towards this transition. Finally, the last proposed section of the bill is a list of Inflation Reduction Act analogs. There's going to be a significant amount of federal dollars coming to New Mexico to help us and ultimately the country reach our climate goals. And in order for New Mexico to receive and disperse these federal monies as efficiently as possible, we need to plan ahead for what IRA provisions make the most sense for New Mexicans. And here I've provided a quick list. These provisions are pulled from the website I have at the bottom, and the website just kind of lays out all the climate and energy provisions that the IRA will help support. And these are just things that the broader climate community feels like really fit into New Mexico's plan. We've laid a lot of the groundwork for many of these programs already, and additional funding from the feds will ensure the full and proper implementation of these programs. And with that, I think I will stand for questions.
Thank you, Sammy. Appreciate the broad overview. So yeah, we are open for questions first from council members.
I guess I'll start. Sammy, this is Rob Black from the New Mexico Chamber. You mentioned that you're looking at a 90% gross emissions at 2050. So if I'm interpreting that right, gross emissions are just any emissions. That's not net emissions. That's net zero there, right?
Correct. Like that means actual reductions of how much we are emitting into the air. It's not using things like carbon offsets or cap and invest, things like that.
So I guess given that our role as a committee is to help grow and diversify our economy, I'd like to hear how this position helps us do that as a broad economic diversification strategy.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I mean, I'm really happy to have followed behind Ricky, because she really put out a really great example of how renewable energy transmission can bring a lot of workforce development here in New Mexico. And part of climate change mitigation and transitioning away from oil and gas is implementing a lot more renewable energy.
I'll also say, Rob, that the other aspect of our committee is to implement the DWS study that is cited within statute, which also points to a lot of economic development through working on emissions reductions.
So fair enough, James, but I think it also, we look at, intelligent manufacturing, biosciences, global trade, these other sectors that are key for our next generation. And we heard from Ricky that, wind and solar is not one for one. And it's nowhere near the tax revenue that needs to be offset. And if we try to tax wind the way we tax oil and gas, we'll put them out of business. So there's a huge revenue difference for the state and how we fund our schools and everything else. So then it's yes, we're transitioning away from oil and gas. That's going to be both a policy and economic choice, or not even choice. It's just going to happen. I think the LFC's already predicted in 10 years, we will start to see New Mexico's revenue as a state begin to drop, and it will never go back up to increase. And that's the LFC and Moody's predicting that. And that's based on oil and gas becoming less of a role in the overall economy. But what I'm concerned about is if we create barriers and roadblocks to other development, it becomes harder for us to diversify our revenue and our jobs for the next generation. So I appreciate that we want to grow that sector of green and renewable. That's absolutely part of our state's strategy. But I'm concerned that this comes at a deficit to the other areas of the strategy that we're also trying to grow. So that's where my question goes.
So the broader climate community, we work alongside people who are in charge of the 30 by 30 initiatives. We work alongside people who are in charge of diversifying the economy with film, with cannabis production, with outdoor recreation and things like that. So like you mentioned, it's not a one-for-one, but that's why it's important for New Mexico to have set in plans for economic diversification and not be so reliant on just one industry, being the oil and gas industry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions, folks?
I have a question.
Sure.
Great. Thank you. Great presentation. Thank you so much. I wonder, and this may address Rob's point as well, but while we're attracting and seeking to attract industries to the state, I really want to think that our plans and policies really attract the clean ones. I mean, there's no reason a bioscience company needs to come to New Mexico and not be in a sustainable manufacturing mode, nor a space company, nor a film company. We're over it. It's too late. All the scientists I work with are pretty sure that we're heading down the really bad path. And if we don't, we can't make accommodations just for economic revenue that conflict with this. But we're also looking at, I mean, that's my opinion. So we're also, and I think what you're laying down is good. We're also, we have a small population as well, and we have a lot of people pursuing entrepreneurship and micro economy kinds of things. Does your plan have any kind of support or mechanism to support a smaller entrepreneurial set of businesses?
Could you elaborate on like what kind of small, like specifically what kind of entrepreneurial practices are you talking about?
I mean, it could be all manner of things. I mean, we are a small business state, so probably, I mean, we could probably count on two hands the number of not small businesses in New Mexico. And so but they must grow and they must flourish. And there are efforts going on to encourage micro manufacturing in small communities and such things. But it takes resources to really stand that up and support. And we do have JTIP, we have other economic resources, but I'm just kind of thinking of how we support rural business growth and if this plan addresses that.
It certainly can. So looking to this council for guidance as well as set forth in Power for Mexico, the idea of like diversifying and making sure that we have a lot of different pockets of revenue, certainly important. When I bring us to this slide, you know, these are pretty high level ideas. So when it comes to creating a trust fund, like maybe what you're talking about can be included in that, like providing a fund for people who are looking to create their own small business. And things like that, maybe creating funds for paid apprenticeships, you know, internships and things like that. Again,
and that's why I really appreciate you, Sammy, being willing to present to us today. And I know that there's a lot of effort going into this plan and that it is this piece of legislation and it's in the draft form. And so, Patricia, I think this is just an opportunity for the council to weigh in on what are pieces of policy that can be put into this legislation that support small businesses throughout the state to take advantage of various federal dollars that are coming down, other various opportunities. I'm very interested, right, in what we're going to get out of the IRA and also the climate bill. And so, Patricia, I invite you and others on the council to lend your expertise and knowledge on ideas you may have for language that should go into this bill.
And I will mention, Patricia, we have Michael Guerrero, who's in the audience right now, and he facilitates and leads Power for Mexico. And they are in the process of doing community member outreach, asking their communities on what they feel like is important to be, what they feel like is important to be included in the energy transition portion of this bill. So I think he heard your feedback, and that's something that we can work on our next sub-policy group meeting.
Perfect. Good.
Any other questions from council members? And if not, I'll open it up to members of the audience who might have questions or thoughts.
James, I'll just finish with, I would ask you to reconsider the idea around gross versus net as it gets to emissions levels. If you look at the Intels of the world, they're not going to meet that. Our agricultural sectors are not going to meet that. So you're putting a ton of pressure and creating a regulatory uncertainty for industries that we are trying to grow. And I think that's where, from a growth and development side, it causes heartburn from our perspective.
Sure.
And that's you, Rob, speaking from the chamber. Appreciate the perspective. And I'll also just say, like, again, this is for this committee, the opportunity here is to think about what we can get into legislation around diversifying the economy with a very specific focus on rural communities, and BIPOC communities. Michael?
Thank you, James. And thanks, Sammy, for your presentation and yeah, for recognizing.
Michael, yeah, absolutely. Michael, just go ahead and identify what org you're with.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yes, Michael Leon Guerrero. I'm the Sustainable Economy Policy Advisor for the Center for Civic Policy. And so, yeah, so Ms. Black, I was also at the Economic Development Conference. Sorry I didn't get a chance to meet you there. I look forward at some point being able to sit down and talking more with you about these issues. One thing I will point out about this, and I'll say a few words about the economic transition as well, is I do think there are opportunities in the IRA that really need to be explored, because I think it could help some of those sectors that you're naming to be able to look at how we can get that kind of support for them to decarbonize, to do the R&D and what might be done to reduce emissions in a whole range of sectors. So I think that's something we should all be looking at. What are the opportunities there in the IRA to get that kind of support? In terms of the economic transition, and you said it, Mr. Black, 10 years in terms of the what we're going to see in terms of the decline of oil and gas. So the economic transition is something we should start investing in now, right? So that we don't leave communities hanging. I've done work on looking at economic and just transitions over the last several years. And the common thing that happens is that that governments react to the decline of industries over and over again, and communities and workers get left hanging. So we have an opportunity now to be able to start investing and creating, developing and setting aside the resources that we're going to need, and then also creating the infrastructure that we need to help those communities now think about what those transitions look like. Colorado has established an Office of Just Transition so that their coal communities, they're looking at how they can coordinate, do some interagency coordination for economic development, help to streamline economic development and facilitate in those communities that are going to be impacted. There are going to be social services and safety nets we're going to need to build up, because we're not going to, like was said earlier, it's not going to be a one-to-one transition, and there's going to be workers are going to need time and their families to be able to make those transitions into new jobs. And then those counties and communities are going to lose revenue and their tax base. So how can we, give them support as they're also going through a process of economic transition? So I think if we start thinking about those things now and creating that kind of infrastructure, then we won't leave those communities hanging like we've seen happen, even in New Mexico, many times in the past. And so that's just making a pitch for that we can, like Colorado, what they're dealing with right now is the lack of funds to be able to implement their transition policies. So we should start looking about how we can set aside money now, so we're not stuck in that situation 10 years from now.
Thanks, Michael. So Marissa and then Mayeni. Marissa, go for it.
Thanks, James, and thank you, Sammy, for the presentation. I just have a quick question. Maybe Mayeni can help answer this too, but just wondering what the process has looked like for tribal consultation and development of the draft bill.
I would love to have Mayeni kick it over, but for just some context and for the for HB6, Mayeni was instrumental in getting the support of APCG, and with that, I'll let her kind of elaborate on what she did.
Yeah, just so some background was this was the language that we agreed upon after going through with the legislative committee for APCG last year. Right now, actually, there's efforts underway. We were speaking, I guess, among the environmental coalition, who is, leading the drafting of this bill, is well aware that, tribal consultation needs to happen within the policy creation process sooner rather than later. So just looking to get that set up through APCG. However, I'm not sure about Navajo and Apache, but this was a language, that was, just to be respective of, I believe this was in the state tribal what is it, compact, a collaboration act. And then the main other concern that is also in the language now was pertaining to, well, it's not in this bill anymore, but pertaining to carbon capture and storage, and making sure that it is in consideration of cultural sites, and that there is a feedback process in that as well. So I think the main point that we had last year was just to make sure that tribal consultation is explicitly mentioned, and it also explicitly said the Indian Affairs Department.
Thanks for that, Mayini.
Yeah, thank you, Marissa, for the question, and Mayini for the background and answer. Are there other questions from council members or audience members?
I have one more. I'm curious, Sammy, thanks for the presentation. It's really helpful to go through the bill or draft legislation like this. I'm curious how the, what is it, just economic office, transition office, will have a different role than the Sustainable Economy Task Force, and just kind of what that's modeled after.
Thank you for the question. I think that's something that we would love to have some guidance from you guys on. In the last session.
Sorry, Sammy, go ahead.
I was going to say, in this last session, we got some direction, instruction from the governor saying, no more task forces, no more advisory groups. So with that limitation, I'm wondering how the council and Set Force would feel about kind of expanding duties and responsibilities of Set Force to maybe include something like a just transition office. Or I mentioned, let me click on this just to make sure I don't make any noise again. So yeah, maybe Set Force can expand to be a JTO, or even maybe go as far as creating, allowing expansion for a climate resiliency office. Right now, Set Force has been tasked with the developing of a plan to implement DWS studies and a few other things, but maybe we can also have them include duties like how to direct funds from, whatever agency for community impact. And I'm sorry, my dog is barking in the background.
I mean, I think it's a really important question. And the issue too that I see, and I think that we all see as volunteers on this committee, is that we're a volunteer committee. And Set Force itself also is comprised of agency heads or their appointees who have, numerous tasks that they have to fulfill. So I personally think that an Office of Just Transition or something similar is really important, because we really do need people, full-time staff, that are concentrating on these issues, and are spending the bulk of their time really working on these issues. And I think that there's an opportunity here for Set Force and SEAC to have an oversight opportunity, or at least an advisory capacity. But I think that this really points to the need for fully funding staff to do this work.
And this is separate from the climate bill, but making sure that our environment department and MNRD are fully funded is definitely going to be a part of that initiative as well.
So any other questions from council members or audience? Great. If not, I have a final question, Sammy. I know that you and I have a through line to each other. So we appreciate, I'll speak for the council. We appreciate this conversation and the opportunity to weigh in on draft legislation, and invite you back to give an update on where the bill is at as you guys proceed with drafting.
Will do. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. If there is nothing else, we'll move on to public comment. Are there members of the public that have any questions or comments that they'd like to make? Okay, Ricky, go for it.
Hi, thanks. I know I already had the floor. I just wanted to make a separate comment to folks on this committee, just to note that this Friday is the last day for applications for the Public Regulation Commission. And so it will continue to be an important body in regulating our electric utilities as well as telecoms. So if you know or would like to apply, if you know anyone who would like to apply, it's a great time to do so. And also the nominating council has meetings this Thursday and next Monday, should anyone from this committee want to give public comment on qualifications of commissioners. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Ricky. Appreciate it. Anyone else? Great. Well, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Anybody want to go ahead and put that motion forward?
Motion, Patricia.
Thank you, Patricia. And a second.
Second, Rob?
Thank you, Rob. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Excellent. Motion approved. And we'll see you all in a month. Looking forward to seeing you all then. Thank you so much for a good meeting.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, James.